Every World Cup produces a trophy, a champion, and a prize money story that gets counted down to the last dollar. This channel has already tracked what happens when that prize money reaches a federation, and how little of it survives all the way to a player's own bank account. But federations and players are not the only two parties standing behind every jersey we watch cross a World Cup pitch. There is a third party in this story, one that almost never appears in a highlight reel or a trophy photo. It is the club, the employer, the organization that pays a player's actual weekly salary every single week of the year, for 6 weeks every 4 years. That club has to hand its most valuable employee over to someone else entirely for free. No transfer fee, no loan payment, no say in how many minutes that employee plays, or how much risk he is asked to carry. A World Cup call-up is the closest thing professional football has to a legally mandated, unpaid loan of your best employee. So this video asks a different question than the usual ones about trophies, medals, or even federation prize money splits. What, if anything, does FIFA actually pay the club that quietly lented a player for the entire tournament? The answer turns out to be two separate programs, running on two completely different sets of rules and two different pools of money. One of them pays clubs simply for releasing a player at all, whether he plays every match or barely leaves the bench. The other only activates if something goes wrong, if a released player comes back injured instead of coming back a champion. Together they form a financial layer of the World Cup that almost never gets mentioned next to attendance records or prize pools. To understand where that layer came from, the story has to go back one full tournament cycle to the Qatar World Cup. FIFA calls this mechanism the Club Benefits Program, and it did not begin with the 2026 tournament in North America. At the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, FIFA set aside a total pool of $209 million for participating clubs. The formula behind that pool was simple on paper. Clubs earned a fixed daily rate for every day a player spent on release. That daily rate worked out to roughly $10,950 multiplied by every single day of the entire release period. A player eliminated in the group stage generated a few weeks of payments. A player who reached the final generated considerably more. When the final accounting came out, one Premier League club topped every other club in the world for total Qatar earnings. Manchester City collected roughly $4.6 million, the direct result of sending a large group of players deep into the tournament. Manchester United followed at around $3.33 million. Chelsea sat close behind at roughly $3.25 million. None of those three clubs lifted the World Cup trophy. Argentina did. Yet all three collected a real, itemized payment from FIFA. In total, 440 different clubs across 51 national football associations received a share of that $209 million. Small provincial clubs that had developed a single player who made a World Cup squad received their own modest slice of the pool. The size of the check had nothing to do with the club's own reputation, market value, or league. It tracked one thing only: how many of its players got called up, and how far each of those players' national teams advanced through the tournament bracket. That formula rewarded player development directly, turning a club's academy pipeline into a measurable, if modest, World Cup revenue stream. Qatar 2022 became the baseline. The next tournament cycle would need to decide whether that baseline was actually large enough. By the time North America's 2026 World Cup came into view, FIFA had already committed to a considerably larger commitment to clubs. The new total pool for the Club Benefits Program reached $355 million, a record figure for any World Cup cycle. That represents close to a 70% increase over the $209 million clubs shared after the Qatar tournament. The daily per-player rate climbed as well, moving from roughly $10,950 up to $11,000 exactly. $11,000 for every single day a player spent away from his club on official national team duty. For a player whose national team exited in the group stage, that daily rate adds up to a payment in the rough range of $160,000. For a player who stayed all the way through the final itself, the accumulated total climbs to somewhere near $285,000. Multiply either of those numbers by an entire senior squad, and a single deep World Cup run becomes a meaningful line item for a club's finance department. The 2026 program also changed who actually qualifies for a payment, not just how much that payment is worth. For the very first time, FIFA extended the Club Benefits Program to cover players released for World Cup qualifying matches, not only the finals themselves. That single change added an enormous number of additional clubs to the list of eligible recipients around the entire world. Clubs whose players never even made the final 48-team tournament could still collect a payment simply for release during qualifying windows. FIFA framed the expansion as recognition that a club's contribution to the World Cup begins years before the tournament itself kicks off. A youth academy that develops a player good enough to be called up during qualifying has already done real billable work for the sport. Under the old rules, that work went entirely unpaid, unless the player's country actually reached the finals in North America. Under the new rules, a portion of that earlier developmental labor finally shows up somewhere on a balance sheet. The expansion also meant a genuinely record number of clubs would share in the $355 million pool this cycle. Hundreds of additional organizations, many of them well outside Europe's biggest and wealthiest leagues, joined the list of eligible clubs for the first time. A provincial club in a smaller football market can now register a real contractual payment from FIFA simply for developing one qualifying-era player. That is a meaningfully different incentive structure than the one that existed just 4 years earlier in the Qatar cycle. It nudges academies everywhere toward producing internationally capable players, since that production now carries a direct and growing financial reward. None of this money touches a player's own paycheck. It moves in a completely separate lane, straight from FIFA to the employing club. A player can generate his club a six-figure World Cup payment without that player personally seeing a single additional dollar of it. The club, not the player, is legally the party being compensated because the club is the one being asked to give something up. That something is 6 weeks, sometimes longer, of a valuable employee's labor, plus every risk that comes with letting him play at full intensity. Risk is exactly where the second, less publicized program comes into the picture, the one that only matters when things go wrong. FIFA calls it the Club Protection Program, and its entire purpose is answering one uncomfortable question clubs ask before every release. What happens if our player gets seriously injured playing for his country, on a pitch we do not control, under a coaching staff that is not ours? Under the Club Protection Program, FIFA compensates a club for wages it keeps paying an injured player during his recovery period. The trigger is specific. The injury has to happen during official national team duty, and the resulting absence has to last at least 28 days. Below that 28-day threshold, the program does not activate at all, regardless of how serious the individual injury actually is. Once that threshold is crossed, FIFA can compensate the club for up to 365 additional days of the player's absence. The maximum insured daily amount comes out to $27,000, a noticeably higher ceiling than the benefits program's flat $11,000. Across a full year of coverage, that ceiling caps out at $7.5 million for a single injury claim. $7.5 million sounds substantial, right up until it gets compared to what some clubs actually pay a single star. The program only reimburses a player's fixed base salary. Bonuses, image rights income, and other variable pay are explicitly excluded from any claim. In practical terms, that caps the effective salary FIFA can fully match at somewhere around £120,000 a week. Plenty of clubs around the world pay players well above that weekly figure, particularly at the very top of Europe's biggest leagues. For those clubs, the Club Protection Program covers a meaningful share of an injured star's wages, but rarely the entire amount. For clubs with more modest wage structures, that same $27,000 daily ceiling can realistically cover a player's full salary. The program, in other words, quietly favors smaller and mid-sized clubs over the wealthiest ones, at least in percentage terms. A giant club absorbs a 7-figure gap on its own books. A smaller club can walk away with its costs almost entirely covered. None of this compensation covers medical treatment costs directly. It only reimburses the wages a club keeps paying while a player cannot play. It also does not cover illness, only injuries classified as accidental, and it explicitly excludes any claim tied to a player's death. Every one of these boundaries exists because FIFA is effectively running an insurance product, and every insurance product needs a defined limited scope. Without that scope, the program's own total funding pool could theoretically be wiped out by a single unlucky tournament cycle. So FIFA draws careful lines: 28 days minimum, 365 days maximum, fixed salary only, accidental injury only. Every one of those lines represents a negotiation between FIFA and the clubs that lobbied for this protection in the first place. Clubs wanted certainty before agreeing to keep releasing their most valuable employees for a tournament they do not control and cannot insure themselves. FIFA wanted a system it could actually afford to fund tournament after tournament without any single injury claim threatening the whole program. Put the two programs together, and a clearer picture finally emerges of exactly how many separate parties a World Cup actually pays. FIFA collects broadcast and sponsorship revenue. It pays federations directly through prize money for tournament performance and placement. Federations then decide, largely on their own, how much of that prize money actually reaches the individual players on their roster. Separately, and through an entirely different channel, FIFA also pays the clubs that release those same players in the first place. That club payment has nothing to do with how the national team performed on the scoreboard and everything to do with days released. A club can collect a real payment even if its player's country loses every single match and exits in the group stage. And if that same player gets injured along the way, a third, separate mechanism exists purely to cover part of his ongoing salary. 3 distinct payment streams, 3 different formulas, 3 different sets of recipients, all triggered by the exact same 6-week tournament. Almost none of these numbers get reported together in the same place, which is exactly why the full picture rarely gets seen. Prize money headlines focus on federations and trophies, transfer market headlines focus on individual player value, club payments barely make headlines at all. Yet for 2026, that quiet third category grew faster than almost any other number tied to the entire tournament, up nearly 70%. $355 million, spread across a genuinely record number of clubs, many of them far outside football's wealthiest circles. A provincial academy that develops one qualifying era player now has a real contractual reason to keep developing more of them. The trophy still goes to one national team. The prize money still flows through one federation, but the club payments now reach almost everywhere. That is the part of the World Cup's financial structure that almost never makes it into a highlight reel, yet quietly shapes where the next generation of players actually gets built. Compound World tracks the events, decisions, and power structures behind the games themselves, built on numbers that are actually checked, never simply guessed.